Hey everyone, not feeling my best this morning because I'm living in a permanently rainy environment right now, which is very moldy, and I have a one of the issues that I developed when I was younger as my health problems is I lived in a student accommodation where mold grew on my ceiling and I got very sick. I had to be moved out of the house. So ever since then I've had a very bad reaction to mold. So probably the old brain, the old noggin's going to be a bit slower. This video, is more. So most of the videos I put out initially, I'm not sure. I've made quite a few. I'm not sure how I organize them, but they're what I call building blocks, just chatting. Um, there's no point in me at this point trying to make an attempt to sort of make a very detailed videos because we have to have enough building blocks to have an intelligent conversation, which is what I'm trying to get us to. Um, there's a lot of things that people haven't studied, and as I said, a different approach I could have taken. I've thought of every which way to try to communicate these ideas. Is that I tell you everything I studied, and you will go away for about 10 years and study this stuff. That's the problem. It's so much information that you would have to study. So I try to chat. I'm all chatting, and some of the things I say are not accurate. They're not exactly where we need to get to. But if I build up enough of these pieces, then we can have a more intelligent conversation, a kind of summary. So this video, I'm kind of just summarize some of the stuff I've said. There's some very important building blocks that I have not gone over because they are, to use this phrase, a rabbit hole. They're just, I know from my own life and talking to people that they're just make people go woozy, and I can't deal with this and I have to walk away. And this is probably the most important building block ultimately that we have to talk about, which is where my own life's work, I believe I have a contribution, which is about human communication and how communication really works, what's really going on in our minds, and no one will believe what I say here because of this program that I've tried to explain, this biological program in our mind, this self-patterning machine, that most of what I am saying and most human communication, the mind gives the illusion that we are understanding what someone is saying or you're reading, but you actually aren't. Now, I will go into this, but I don't want to start with this. Is what I call polymorphic resolution. But we can't even begin to talk about that too much without building up this understanding of the mind from what perspective of a biological program machine. I'm not, and I've said in other videos that's not the full truth, but it's a perspective, it's a red pill, a perception shift is for you to understand the mind as a biological program. And then these other perceptions I have is what I've gone over as this other perspective, this other red perception shift of you as your what I call your symphonic self that you aren't actually here. And I've talked about this in these other videos. And eventually we're going to put all these things together. There's going to be a lot of gaps and whatever. It's going to take a lot of time. So let me take a pass through in this video. And I have my green drink here. I need to drink. This is how I try and, or I call orient my brain in the morning, because I often wake up feeling a bit discombobulated, and I have to get this thing going. All sorts of fascinating substances in this drink, nothing illegal of course, all natural. Let me try and summarize what I have said, or I think I've probably said so far, because it's hard to keep track of everything I've said. And it'll be helpful once I can get other people on here, because the way our mind works in terms of true understanding, so if you think of when you learn something like math, people who say that I had this through my whole life is, Mark, you're such a good teacher. My kids and everything. So the reason what makes someone a good teacher is they understand that a person needs multiple perspectives. So if I was teaching you something in math, so algebra, something I understand very well, is things like algebra because I had to do so much of it. A lot of kids struggle in certain areas of algebra. So this is relevant ultimately to what I'm trying to say to you, because the same thing that occurs in teaching somebody anything is occurring in what I'm trying to teach you all from what's in my head. What I would look at there is usually they have missing building blocks. There's something earlier on that they didn't understand. Maybe it was something as early as to do with numbers or to do with arithmetic. So what I say is that knowledge is built like think of an Egyptian pyramid, and as a base, and then you put the next layer and you keep building layers. Knowledge is built in layers, what I call layers of abstraction. And if you missed something, if there was a missing block earlier on, say you're trying to learn this algebra, that's why children get confused, because there's something earlier on. Now, it takes some ability. So what makes a good teacher is to notice, like to figure out what they're missing and then go back and teach that. The problem with our school system, with why most people, in my perception, and I've talked to other people that have done very advanced math and science and had children, and they agree with me about this, that kids are expected to always be going to the next level, and then they're not really allowed to go back. If you're in high school and you're expected to be doing something like calculus, it's hard to go back and sort of realize that you don't have what I call a proper number sense or a full understanding of everything, even in arithmetic, because that's easy stuff. But if you don't have that, all those building blocks, this is now messing you up. What's happened is it's shifted into what we could call your subconscious, but I'm saying this biological patterning machine that I've talked about. So it's not even in your awareness. It needs someone outside of you to spot that. Now, taking that same idea, and then also sometimes people need a different way of coming at something they don't understand. They're confused in one way. They can be taught another way. We call multimodal, the mode in which you think. So a good teacher will be able to take a different approach and won't try to force kids all into one way of learning. And I've talked about NLP, about how we know from that examination of learning that people all have different learning modes. School tends to try to force everybody into one size fits all, which is going to fail out a lot of people who think differently and think in different ways. So it's completely unproductive, really, except for the people that, again, the lions that fit the archetype, the people that fit that particular system. They seem smart and they do well, but it's not the other people aren't. It's just that approach didn't often fit well for them. Okay, it wasn't a good fit to their particular learning modes. There's a lot of people in education, special education, that know this more. Anyway, so I'm fully aware of all these issues and things that I'm trying to teach. I just know that there's no one way without everybody going and studying everything I studied and us spending 20 years going over that. So this is the best I can do, is this rambling bloody blah in these videos. Believe me, if I could using telepathy, download like in the Matrix or plug it in, that would be superb, but we don't have that. So let's summarize as I can the building blocks of this pyramid, this layers of knowledge that we're trying to build up here. What I've been trying to describe to you is two key perspectives. One is this perspective of people say to me, well, okay, get talking to me and understand that I've studied a lot, like, well, how does the mind really work then? Okay, so there's no one perspective that can truly explain how the mind works, but the first one that I've been trying to give you is this perspective of that you are a biological computer or a machine, if you like. That scales up from starting with DNA code that is read by cells in the body. The cell in your body has intelligence, or if you like, or information or intelligence, that knows how to read that code and then do something with it. What it does with it is it creates what we call proteins, and proteins are building blocks to build biological life. Your whole body basically works via cells reading bits of code we call genes and creating proteins from that. For very complicated, if you go, you can go and read how that process was. It's very complicated, and geneticists biologists have figured out a lot. We haven't figured out everything, but they figured out a lot of how this process works. You can read about things like transcription, and even things that you're hearing about COVID, like mRNA, is part of this process. And but it's very similar to, if we take why I take the computer model, how a computer works. I studied all of this, is what I worked in. We largely, in some ways, probably got a lot of ideas in computing from examining our own biology, frankly. The difference is that our machines, our electronic machines, is working through silicon processors, transistors, and electricity, whereas our biology is working through this genetic code that is interpreted by cells. So from that point of view, when we look at the mind and say, as I've tried to describe, I gave different ways of thinking about it in some of the videos. The mind is just a machine, and it's executing a program. Every single one of us is just like a program that has adapted to our environment. We came here with a DNA code and essentially adapted and created, I talked about channels, it created a program, it's a biological program, effectively, that we perceive to be ourselves. And a lot of people who work in that could say that we have no free will, there's no choices, this is an illusion, what we call emulation, which I talked about. Now, you yourself will think, well, that's crazy, because I know I make choices and I know I think about things. No one's disputing that you have a perception of feeling like you make a choice and that you feel things. What it's saying is, though, that those choices are predetermined by this biological program. But I've explained, I'm summarizing what I've said in the videos, I've explained why, even from a purely scientific point of view, I don't agree fully with that, because of quantum physics and the fact that the mind is a quantum computer. So even at that biological level, there would be some differences beyond the purely sort of mechanical, purely deterministic mind, what we could call in computing a finite state machine, if you want to look into that. But so I don't, that again, try to get away from this, it's all this, or binary thinking. I'm saying largely it is, air quotes, true that we could perceive our minds are biological computers, biological machines, that with predetermined choices and thoughts that we all have based on this adaptation of our biology into our environment. Now I also gave you, so I eventually can go into more of that, and the key element missing there is also, I say, about human communication, which I spent most of my life trying to figure out, and I worked in field of computing that allowed me to figure out more of this, more detailed layers down the rabbit hole, if we want. That's what I mean by down the rabbit hole, looking deeper and deeper. And I can explain from that why a lot of sci-fi and ideas about AI are flawed, why AI will never be what people are thinking or projecting there, and that will be ditched in favor of biological, creating biological computers, if you like, which is what we really could be perceived that we are. And you could speculate that somebody created us as biological computers, not necessarily the idea of a god, but even more advanced other alien races. In my, I'll throw this out here, I know I say things that people think, oh, that's great. Look, probably if we were another million years advanced and move forward with this kind of advancements, it's very likely that we could come up with a code like DNA and then throw it out all over the Milky Way and see how that, but out of the interest of seeing how that adapted and and evolved. So I think it's quite possible that a very advanced alien race seeded life all over, life as we perceive it, this DNA code over the Milky Way for that very reason. And in that sense, you could say it's a simulation. It's they're wanting to observe this development. Why? I've had all these discussions with people. So why would they do that? Well, again, logic tells me, going logically, I've thought forward. I've been very gifted in the area of sort of being able to see logically the development of us in my lifetime accurately, because I can base it in logic that it makes sense, because eventually we'd want to understand or observe our own development. Let's say we would then create a code that's how our code was based, and then send it out and watch it develop over millions of years, right? You could think of that like a laboratory experiment, but it's out here. And then we could take that further, but I don't want to go further with that right now. In that sense, God could be, if you want to take it even further than just the alien race doing that, the idea of a God could be a sort of a scientist who wanted to observe his is the wrong word, there's no gender, but its own development. And this is closer to my understanding of, from this other perception of what we are. So if we move on to that, like I've said, that I know that some of us have this ability, this other perception. You think of your senses, sight, sound, whatever, but it's other perception to perceive more what we are. That's not, this perception is not contained within this box we could call the physical rules or physics, this domain. That is part of my understanding. So if you think of, I've tried to explain, if your body is biologically is made up of cells, and each cell is an independent functioning unit, but it makes up you, your whole. Each of those cells is unique, like you are unique, but it also organizes to a whole we could call the collective consciousness. What I'm saying when people talk about the idea of a God, or what could be this scientist, if you want to call it that wanted to observe itself, is the same thing. Each of our what I call symphonic selves is trying to learn and observe itself, is also not here, this where we really are, this outside of this box, is part of this collective that you could perceive as a God. It's actually, as my perception of what now I say up front, I tell people all the time, I can only perceive so much, and maybe I'm trying to interpret through intellect sometimes, but I think it's a lot more complicated. But the trouble is that our minds are not capable of comprehending, so it gets kind of fruitless to try. And as people ask me, I can say a lot more on that, but it starts to become fruitless because we're just simply not capable as a cell, as this individual symphonic self, of understanding this whole as such. But it would also have to talk about a branch of mathematics that I have done a lot of work in, called fractal mathematics. So a fractal is everywhere in everything you see. So for example, a leaf is a unique shape, or a snowflake is unique, but it's templated, it's based on a similar, all snowflakes are similar, they have a template, but they're all unique. The same with the leaf. And the thing is, the closer up you get to them, so like a mountain looks the same as you get closer to it, it still looks the same. You could even get down on your hands and knees and look at soil, it still looks the same shape. This is how fractals work. I'd have to explain more. You could look into fractal mathematics, fractal geometry. I've done an awful lot of work in this in the area of stock markets. And this is a huge conversation, which I will save for another video, because it is very important one, which started in, as far as I know, the Renaissance and understanding of this, Fibonacci and golden spirals with Da Vinci, and it's really, really interesting and important. But what I'm saying is that, so this other perception I have, this other viewpoint of what we are, comes from that. So how do I put those two together? So what I talked about is that started to, but I think this is where I have to go next, is to talk about what, I talked about quantum manifesting, that we'll have to talk, we need some more building blocks, because we need to talk a bit about quantum physics, which I will do a sort of primer on the important elements of quantum physics that we need, so we can have a conversation about this idea of quantum manifesting. And you can read books like The Holographic Universe. I haven't read any of these books. I really have not read very much. So why, Mark, have you not read that much? Because something in me in this journey knew that I wanted to figure things out for myself, because I knew, I had this knowledge, this predetermined knowledge, if you want to call it that, that by doing so, if then when I looked what other people had thought, that if it matched what I had concluded through this journey, then there would be more truth to it, because the perception that the truth is in everybody is this is a long conversation, but the truth is in everybody. Okay, this is why someone like Jesus' message, what I call, resonates with so many people, because that truth is in everybody, what Jesus is saying, or other people. Sometimes that truth isn't a good truth, like a Hitler who's resonating hate. So this idea of these vibrations that I'm talking about, or I say that you're a piece of music, that you have all these different potential pieces of music in you, if you like, or vibrations that can be resonated. And my mind's going to go off on this, but it's like I say to people, why do some people love a certain piece of music? Let's play you Bohemian Rhapsody. Some people, oh my god, I hate that, it's terrible, what the hell is that? Other people, oh my god, this is the most amazing thing. Or it could be Mozart, or it could be rap, it could be whatever. Why? It's not the piece of music, because if it's the piece of music and we're all biologically the same, we should all like the same thing. It's because your symphonic self, this other self that is not part of your biological machine, is resonating to that music. Now, this is where we kind of leave Kansas, is if I say to you, in fact, that, like, for example, I should go into this, because so how did Freddie Mercury write Bohemian Rhapsody? And I say to you, he didn't write Bohemian Rhapsody. What? He downloaded Bohemian Rhapsody from his symphonic self, not from this domain, from himself, symphonically. And anyway, if you listen to musicians, so there's two types of creativity. One I call templated, which you're just rearranging pieces of a puzzle. Music's a good example. It sounds similar, but it's slightly different. Like all rock music is kind of similar. It's the same song, same structure, but you just move the pieces around. But then you get pieces of music like Bohemian Rhapsody or something like Mozart. These people that come with something that's completely creative and original. Like in math, we would say Newton with calculus, or Einstein with relativity. There's just no one that ever came anything close to that. It's just purely creativity. What I'm saying to you is, and this is you're really beginning to understand how I'm perceiving things. If you begin to understand this, is that you didn't think your way to those things, because that's intellect. You can't think your way to relativity or Bohemian Rhapsody or Mozart. Though that came from this other place, this download of symphonic self, or I would say they manifested that information into this experiential domain. What? Okay, so we will get there eventually, but that's what's going on. So for an example of Newton created calculus as a type of mathematics that no one had perceived. We can go through how that works. It's just very creative and original. But at exactly the same time, another person in Europe, I think in Austria, a guy called Leibniz, I think, also created calculus. And then they argued about, like, whether one plagiarized the other, like people do with music sometimes. So this is really, like, gonna get crazy here. What I'm gonna say, if you're very heavily in the intellectual journey that I talk about, you're not going to accept this. I fully understand why. What I'm saying to you is that neither Newton nor Leibniz created calculus. They both downloaded that because the collective consciousness was ready to manifest that information into the domain. It's similar to quantum physics. Why could we not discover quantum physics? I mean, Einstein was pretty smart, most people agree. Savant genius. So like Leonardo, these people, Newton, there's lots of them actually that most people don't know about. But why do we discover certain things that we do? It's like, classical physics until quantum physics. Because we weren't, the simplest way to say it is the collective consciousness wasn't ready for that understanding. And similarly, our understanding, like quantum physics, we cannot perceive currently anything like discovering anything different. We also have this thing called string theory, which we'll talk about, which is not really science, it's math, but it tells us something about science that we need to discuss. Um, we can't perceive the next step because we're not ready, but once we're ready, we will suddenly discover another perception, another red pill shift of perception about science. Um, and in some ways, I wouldn't argue, because I don't argue, but I would say to you in words that are not accurate because we can't get there, that this is the rules themselves, the physics rules of the domain that we perceive, are evolving through our own collective consciousness. So eventually we will evolve to a point where this separation of what I'm saying, this machine, this biological machine, and our physics, will eventually get rid of this veil, the gap, the invisible barrier between that and our symphonic self, and the two domains, this symphonic self that most people can't perceive, that I and a small percentage of people perceive. I think all of you can perceive it to some extent, and I will talk about that, how to do that, will eventually become together, and those two domains will become the same domain. Okay? And it's important to understand that this other symphonic self I'm saying that you are, which is where you're putting on this virtual reality headset, if you want to think about that, or falling into a dream, shifting your consciousness here into what you perceive as yourself, is not heaven. Like people say, is that is like, what are you saying? No, not at all. That is just one. It's a fractal. So you have to look at fractal math. So that is just one of an infinite, or possibly infinite, set of domains of our consciousness that you could call God. That's very difficult to comprehend unless we understand more about fractals and whatever. So essentially, so people say to me, to summarizing this conversation as best I can, where we've got to so far, is there a God? It doesn't mean anything to me unless you have all this. Is well, in a sense, I would rather call it God. Every single one of us, and it is part. It's like a cell that is part of this, but it's much more than that. Our consciousness, our fractal consciousness, that's spread out over infinite domains. And I know that doesn't probably mean much to a lot of people at this point. But these are very difficult concepts to get across. So in spirituality, a way that people have, the truth is in everybody. So people like someone like Buddha was someone who was highly, was a gray zoner basically, like me or lots of other people, this 1% that try to express some of this. So that's what the observer and the observed. So the observer is this symphonic self, the observer is this material self, physical self right now, and then there is an observer of the observer of the observed, which is this higher conscious collective consciousness, and it goes on. It's a fractal, if you want to look into that. So that was something I wanted to add there. I need another sip of my green drink. Yeah, I was going to say, it's interesting because I've never taken drugs. I know quite a few people that have taken a lot of drugs. So it's interesting with Huxley. I mentioned Huxley. My wife read Doors of Perception and a lot of Huxley's work and said, I think this guy's a lot like you, the way he thinks. Yes, well, we'll talk about that. We'll talk about branches of the tree and what branch of the tree you're on, which relates to my material, intellectual, symphonic self, where you are on that journey. But Huxley talked about, I haven't read it, but having discussions with people have, that taking mescaline, which is a drug that tries to open hence the doors of perception, your perception, similar. Obviously the authors of the movie The Matrix read that as a reference to it, if I go through that. So what's interesting when I talk to people is, I think when people take these drugs, what they are perceiving on those drugs is very much like how a gray zone, how our minds are perceiving everything all the time. This is what it is like. Or maybe, but it doesn't incapacitate our logical capacities or intellectual capacities like those drugs might. But I think this is what I as best I can tell, I probably should try and take these things at some point and compare and contrast it. But it's like, I'm pretty sure from conversations with people that is the case. But the the problem with that, as Huxley mentioned, like, is then it gets into that metaphysical thing. Is like, how do you? Well, I took a drug. How do I trust perceptions on a drug? Okay, so that's another rabbit hole there. Hence the symbol. The girl in that scene is the scene where Neo is giving a hacker program to the guy that comes to the door, and the girl has the rabbit, the white rabbit. Follow the white rabbit is a reference to that, and he's saying he's just had a red pill experience, a shift of perception, because something happened on his computer, a hack that he knew is not possible within the rules of hacking. And it's freaked him out essentially, and the guy sounds like you're like a triple mescaline or whatever. Okay. Anyway, I've tried to summarize in this conversation. So, as much as it seems like I've said a lot, I really haven't said that much. I always talk about chiseling away on the rock, trying to reveal a shape. The shape is the truth inside everybody that I'm trying to get to. Our shapes are all uniquely, slightly different, fractal, but there's a truth in everybody that everybody can get to through this journey. But it cannot be simply expressed in words. It cannot be expressed simply in the perspective of a biological machine or intellect. I can't do it through physics, because we also need this symphonic perception, and the problem is that's not within this intellectual domain. It's not within intellect, it's not within science, it's not within biology, and most people don't have much of it. So I could spend a lot of time trying to say, how do you develop this? So this would greatly help this ability to communicate this. But when I decided to, at like 45 years old, to then read what other people have said, and I was reading what a lot of like Taoist mentors and most people who try to be like, I'm a spiritual guru, we've talked about this, are not actually spiritual gurus, they're just fooling themselves and other people, but the genuine ones that I could see had taken this journey said what I have concluded, which is that it's either in your rock or it isn't. Like they said, I can't actually teach somebody this because it has to be in your rock, it has to be in your shape. It's like if you're Freddie Mercury or you're Mozart or you're Van Gogh, can you really teach somebody to be the same? You can't. It has to be in their rock. We're all these unique leaves on the tree, on a certain branch of a tree. We're all at different points of our evolution. So I don't, as I currently understand it, as conversations I've had with people about this, that I don't believe it's possible to, air quotes, teach, even through these levels of abstraction. I think everybody can move forward. I can give you ideas of how to try to tap into your symphonic self. But ultimately, it's a journey. It's this really long journey, and you have to go through it. And so this is why I sort of joke that if it were possible, Lao Tzu or Jesus or whatever could have just told everybody, oh, this is the answer. It's like an exam paper. Like, this is the full journey. Here it is. Just read this, and we're all done, and we're all out of here. But the point is, you have to take the journey. So no one person, there is no guru, I keep repeating it, one person that can tell you all this for that reason. It's genius is what it is. This consciousness is friggin' savant genius to the power of a million. I mean, once you begin to understand all the rules of this domain and how it's all set up, it's absolutely mind-blowing. It makes me cry, to be honest. Like, as I began to understand this, because it's just so perfect. Like, it allows every single person, every single leaf, every single shape to evolve itself without anyone else being able to, the high schooler to come to the first grader and tell them all the answers. It's incredible. Everywhere we look at the observer effect in quantum physics. We look at the mind, trying to observe the mind as discovering it's a quantum computer, so you can't observe consciousness, you can't observe the mind. At every turn we are blocked from short-circuiting this journey and getting the answers from that intellectual point of view that we would like to get. Or the veil, I call this, is the veil is this protection, so every person can go through the journey for themselves, because it's the journey the steps themselves that are important, not the end point of having the knowledge that grey zoners have or whatever. So why, you could even argue, why am I doing this? Because shouldn't I? Isn't this an attempt to? And I've gone through this with myself. But all I can tell you is it's so powerfully been in me since I was a small child. This journey that I've gone on has been so fated out to do everything and learn everything I have and all the things that happened, that, and I know in me that I'm supposed to do this. I can't say any more than that. Things that I've talked about, that where you draw powerful energy from them, that's part of your true symphonic self of why you came here, not the artificial reasons that came from your adaptations to environment that most people perceive as their identity. That's more like being an actor and taking on a role, and you can just swap that out to something else. Okay, I've said quite a few things in here that are probably new to what I've said in the other ones. It's kind of cool. It's just like a summary of some of this stuff and maybe where we're going. So we're always going to be blending a lot of science type thinking, logic thinking, eventually with this symphonic thing. The science and logic thinking is easier in some ways, but it's hard because I know a lot of people haven't studied a lot of that stuff, and as I said, unless you will go and read, go on to a degree in physics and then go on to a degree in artificial intelligence or something, or go and study everything in brain sciences and biology, it's a lot. So we'll be here, I'll be tapping my fingers waiting for everybody to do that. So I'm doing my best to simplify some of the stuff I understand from that, and I don't have a super deep understanding of some of that stuff now because I forget it. I just take, when I studied it I did, but then I've just taken the most important elements of those things for these discussions. But ultimately the most important thing is this other perception that is where the problem is, with why Lao Tzu said that you can't communicate the Tao, if you want to call it that. The Tao could be, you could perceive as a symphonic self, it can't be communicating words. To understand why it can't, that is where, so that's a very deep rabbit hole that I will try and communicate, this polymorphic resolution issue of intellect, where intellect connects to or bridges to this symphonic self, is very, I can't even put it into words. It's very difficult to discuss. I can take us through several layers of that about language, and I'll do that. We'll talk about sensory language and then abstract language or concepts, something called conceptual clustering, of how the mind is trying to make sense of information it's perceiving. But ultimately, I'm telling you up front, it then goes into what I call magic, and then magic happens. And the magic is this connection. So everybody is continuously tapping into your symphonic higher self, that's somewhere else through. So what I tell people is that the experience of intellect is actually happening there as well. Everything we feel and even intellect, thoughts, is actually happening in this other place. We just perceive it to be here. But there's limits on intellectual thought within this, like the rules of physics that limit us. That's why no one can, like in sci-fi, have these superpowers where they can break the rules of physics, because if you could do that, that would defy the purpose of the domain. The rules of physics are part of this domain for a reason, which we will discuss. They are basically how we learn. This is a teaching tool for our consciousness, and the laws of physics can't be broken for that reason. They can evolve, as I said in the thing, but they can't be broken as they stand now, because that's why, I've never met anybody that can move objects. Why? Because that would break these rules, and we can't do that, because that would mean that it wasn't a teaching tool. That it's sort of like when you go bowling and you have those lanes, those buffers, so the ball goes down. Believe it or not, the rules of physics are here to teach us, because they give us what we call conditional. If I in this domain do this, then the result is that. and that's how we learn, and that's what the rules of physics do for us. Whereas in a dream where you don't have any physical rules and you can just use your imagination, you can do anything, it's kind of like the Shakespeare Tempest, which was put in the movie Forbidden Planet, and the idea then the aliens freed themselves from physical rules, and then they destroyed themselves because they couldn't control their imagination, so they're subconscious. So that's those two shifts of consciousness, your dream world where you can use your imagination versus this physical ruled world, that they're both really the same thing. It's that here it shows you the consequences of your imagination or your thoughts, if you want to call them that. But they ultimately, all of it is actually in your symphonic self. So everything you feel and experience, your emotions, your feelings, but intellectual thought is also there. An interesting discussion that's related to this is I had with my son once, is like, well, he's always arguing for AI can be us, and I said, well, it can experience, it potentially can experience, but it couldn't have a human experience. That's a difference, a biological experience, unless it was biological, and we can discuss that down the road. But it's possible that AI could have its own experience in this way that I'm talking about. I don't know on that one. I don't know. I don't have a perception of that, so I can't say, but it is quite possible, because the same way that a rock is perceiving or observing itself, in the same way the universe is observing itself, everything. It's just not in the same way we perceive it, because we think of feelings as human feelings and perceptions. Okay, thrown quite a lot out in this one, things that we've got trying to go over, things that we're going to go. I'll say one last thing, so an idea on so I'm saying everybody is actually tapping into this symphonic self. It's just that most people don't have this perception of it, or this awareness of what I'm saying. I give you one that I think a lot of people can start to experience if they try, which is you have to so this is the irony, is that to perceive your symphonic self, it's kind of a black and white, either or with intellect. The more you use your intellect in this domain, the less able you are to perceive this symphonic self. So you have to ultimately, as much as I am pro intellect, as I've said, learning logic, reason, science, if you want to perceive that in that moment, you have to turn it off. You have to learn how to turn that off. So we'll discuss that, like how you turn it off, and also immersing yourself in the domain nature, you could call it. So like, for example, and this sounds corny, going out and lying under the stars and looking at stars and just trying not to think, and just for a long time, not 5 minutes ain't gonna cut it. The whole I call garnish mindfulness, all this nonsense is where you're trying to kid yourself that you're meditating when you're really not. Like, I don't have the time to meditate, so I'll do 5 minutes of mindfulness. Okay, well, you're not going to get very far with that, trust me. That's why you don't see many monks who spend the whole lifetime meditating, doing 5 minutes of mindfulness. Okay, so it takes a lot of work to really learn introspection and these perception shifts. But if you take the time and really immerse yourself in nature, try to stop thinking, turn off all your technology, don't talk to people, try, and then it will just, hopefully a lot of people will kind of come to you. You'll get the sense, some people describe it as just feeling small and feeling like the universe is infinite and I'm this tiny thing. That's kind of the start of it. That's kind of start of getting in touch with your symphonic self. So I'll talk all about those things eventually, if the mighty smiter doesn't take me away. Who knows what's going to happen, but hopefully I get there. There's lots and lots of different ways on experiences, but they mostly involve actually trying to turn off everything, your logic and reason and intellect. But as I say, that stuff is still really valuable and important and part of the journey, but you can't just do this other stuff. But also loss, so being around death and loss is very important. I had a very transformative experience holding a beloved pet and holding that animal as it died in the transition out from the physical domain. So death, which a lot of people try to cut themselves off from, is cutting us off from this perception also. Lots of things I can think of. Those things, that's why I think near death for people often can shift their perception to have more of understanding of this also. Probably people who have terminal diseases towards the end of that may get this perception also. They have to confront their mortality. When we're all just running around like busy ants and we're all caught up and we're all caught up in our intellect, you really don't have any ability to perceive any of this either. So even in myself, as I say, it kind of swaps us to a different mode where you can think of your consciousness shifting into this physical domain. So you lose that perception. Alright, I'm going to finish my green drink and we'll see where we go on the next one. Take care.